In this ClimateGenn episode, I speak to Dr. Ye Tao at Harvard University, who is head of the Mirrors for Earth's Energy Rebalancing, or MEER. With global agriculture across the world at high risk from rising temperatures and associated impacts, Ye's team are proposing increasing the Earth's reflectivity in order to reduce the temperature within the biosphere. In this interview, we go into some details about how it works, resource requirements, where it would be deployed, and the pathway to scaling up. Ye also highlights the need for more understanding of psychology in order to be able to align the growing numbers of people around the world who are realizing that our future is in a perilous state. By bringing people together, putting our well-being and safety before profit and extractive endeavours, only then do we really stand a chance of seeing these grand ideas tested and eventually deployed. We have much to lose and everything to play for. A special thank you this week to Marion Troyer, who sent in a transcript of my last interview with Dr. Tero Mustonen. This interview received terrific feedback and resonated with a great many people, not least myself, so I'm really grateful for this support. You can also access all previous episodes on my website, genn.cc, on YouTube, all podcast channels, and of course on Patreon, where you can support this work as well. And thank you to all my new patrons who are supporting this series, and to everyone for listening, commenting, and getting in touch. Let me start again. So yeah, thank you very much for speaking to me today about the Mirror for Earth's Energy Rebalancing. Can you start by giving a brief view through your lens of the climate crisis? How do you see or frame the issue from an emergency perspective?
I think the major emergency I see is that mainstream discussions doesn't really address what's needed really to solve the issue. So we're still focusing on talking about fossil fuel reductions and having a timeline out to 2050. But if you look at the physics, by 2050, we would have long passed 2 degrees Celsius, regardless of what we do. So what I see is that there's a huge lag between the latest understanding of the science and physics and what's being discussed and what's actually feasible given those discussions. So I think the gigantic system has some time lag. That's really the problem. And to add more difficulty, like people on the forefront, including activists, are not always, immediately informed of what's necessary in order to solve the issue. So many people like to work on their favorite solution, there's a favorite approach, and sometimes at the expense of excluding others. So there's also lack of conversation within the activist community and even different scientific communities. That's also part of the issue. So there's a lack of central leadership and a centralized problem analysis.
Okay. And you mentioned that even if we were to achieve all these targets, we're going to surpass the 2 degrees limit. 2 degrees, I mean, that is pretty much a disaster for everybody. So maybe we should sort of go into MEER. MEER stands for Mirrors for Earth's Energy Rebalancing. Can you talk a little bit about how this fits into this 2 degrees framework?
So the basic problem of climate change that we're facing is not really an excess of CO2. The basic problem that's impacting people's livelihoods and ecosystems is an excess of heat. It's a thermal stress that we're experiencing, whereas hurricanes and more random and more extreme precipitations. These are all driven by an excess of energy flux and thermal energy accumulation in the biosphere. So what MEER is trying to do is to bypass the slow step of greenhouse mitigation and capture to really tackle the heat flux directly, and doing so in a way that also brings about immediate adaptation benefits. And in doing so in a way that catalyzes a faster transition to renewables, which would then solve the underlying root problem. So if one does a basic energy analysis of the problem, the climate, what we call a climate monster out there, has a power of several hundred to 1,000 terawatts. And that's 50 times roughly bigger than the 18 terawatts that humanity possesses in the form of fossil fuel power. So essentially, if we were to, going to solve this problem, which is the thermal excess heat being accumulated, we cannot really tackle it using conventional technologies of heat removal. And if you think about greenhouse gas capture, it's fundamentally limited by thermodynamics, the entropy of mixing. There's some fundamental limit that you cannot do better even through engineering, because these are the minimum energy that's needed to emit the CO2. And that amount of energy is roughly 300 exajoule if we were going to go back to 350 ppm. And that would take the US military 300 years to perform such a task. So unless you think that somehow in this day and age, the world could come together to build another task force the size of the US military, 10 times, let's say, then we won't be able to solve the issue by carbon capture before 2050. So those are the fundamental challenges.
Okay, we'll come back to this idea of the Earth coming together, because I think that's a sort of challenge in itself in tackling these problems. But your proposed solution essentially is using mirrors to increase the Earth's reflectivity and reflect back the sun's heat. Is that, in a nutshell, a bit like we would expect from the Arctic sea ice that we've lost and is now absorbing heat? These mirrors kind of reflect heat. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's the fundamental idea. But in practice, we like to really think of it as an adaptation measure. That's why we're busy trying to set up experiments and collecting data, measuring how much mirrors can cool their local environments, their soils and the airs in their surroundings. Because if you think about the Earth, even now, even without climate change, there's a huge range of climates, microclimates on Earth. There are periods in Earth's history where there's no life that's really possible in certain regions that's underneath the glaciers, several kilometers deep. So if we just say for a second, saving the entire ecosystem and all of humanity is a gigantic challenge, which we want to do as much as we can to achieve that goal. But if we manage to safeguard a large proportion of it, or a small fraction of it, that's better than nothing on this planet. If we can safeguard a part of our civilization, there's the chance that we can eventually reclaim ecosystem and really restore the whole planet if we had enough time. So it's very important to look at the local impacts, whether we can build livable local microclimates using technology such as MEER. And preliminary data seems quite encouraging in that we have achieved on the order of 5 to 10 degree cooling, even just using one single device that's a couple feet on the side. So from a implementation point of view, eventually cooling the globe, that's a gigantic undertaking, and it will be a process. You have to always take the first step. But if the first step already brings about local benefits that can help the people implementing it, then it's a way to do it that's not totally altruistic. And all evidence indicates that the majority of humans may not be as altruistic as we hope they would be. Therefore, understanding human psychology and motivation on how we act is equally important as having the right strategy when it's really scaled up.
Okay, well, you've just mentioned the word scaled up. If you were going to take this into a region or you talked about local cooling, and that was going to be one of the areas I wanted to touch on as well. Are there regional, local implications? What sort of scale on a regional basis would we be talking? A football field, 10 football fields, hectares? What's the sort of area? And what's the resource cost of this?
So in terms of area, we like to think about these things as a fractional coverage. So ongoing experiments that we're designing for implementation in 2022 will answer the question of at what fractional coverage of a piece of land, say the size of a basketball field, do you start to measure measurable changes in air temperature and soil temperature and moisture? And exactly where in the end we want to implement, we think it needs to be coupled to type of land usage that's already unavoidable, namely agriculture. So we want to find, for different kind of crops, what kind of coverage percentage would boost the yield of different crops, especially in thermally and the water-stressed areas. Because the expectation is that when you lower temperature, you decrease evaporation needs. Also, in many parts of the world, especially in Western United States, and Middle East and many parts of India that's already under water stress, there's generally not a lack of sunlight. Sometimes there's excess sunlight. So how can we find the optimal fractional coverage for different local climates and agricultural needs in order to more than compensate for the aerial coverage that the MEERs take up in boosting the agricultural yield? So those are some fundamental questions we're trying to answer. And you also asked about the question of cost. So the MEERs that we're trying to design and deploy are made of mostly just glass. And glass are composed of 6 of the most abundant elements in the Earth crust, namely silicon, sodium, calcium, oxygen. Let's say those are the major ones, and the magnesium. And one can do a cost analysis in several ways. One is commercially, like how much it would cost to buy, say, glass for the mirror. You can nowadays buy, let's say, 1 meter squared of glass, probably 5mm to 10mm thick for about $1 at large quantities. And such a piece of glass can offset about 100 kilos of CO2 when it's coated by a thin film of aluminum. And the coating energy, et cetera, is very much minor compared to glass fabrication energy because of the minute quantity of aluminum 100 nanometer that's needed. So most of the economic and energy costs in making glass mirrors is melting of the glass and also a small fraction for mining and transportation. But if we only consider the energy needed, it's about 10 cents for 1 meter squared of mirror. So if the project really scaled, the fabrication cost for enough mirror to offset 1 ton of CO2 is on the order of $10. And if this device can then be deployed on a piece of land that's, say, 100 meters squared and boost the yield by 20%, then the economic benefit should, in principle, more than cover for the cost of deployment.
Okay. And just go back to, you talked about looking in 2022 at what fraction of area would have to be reflective in order to impact regional climates or local climate. When you take the Earth as a whole, and if we talk about the whole, trying to stay below 2 or 1.5 degrees, whatever temperature goal you set, have you worked out, A, how much would you need in terms of global coverage, and how long would it take to get to that point in terms of deployment?
Yes, so we more or less need to increase Earth's reflectivity by, say, on the order of 1 or 2%. And that can be achieved if roughly 10% of croplands were outfitted with mirrors, say, by the end of the century. So we have the remainder of the century to deploy these slowly, and doing so while learning about response of local systems and also global climate. So it's a project which will take time because 10% of cropland is a gigantic area, but we have luckily a few decades to do so. And the real challenge is to ramp up these glass and mirror production to a rate that allows compensating for contemporaneous emissions in CO2 and other greenhouse gases. If we can deploy enough every year that cancels what we added that year, then the Earth climate would more or less stabilize. And eventually, because of hopefully the faster decay rates of components like methane and also initially CO2, it's possible that if we reach that target of instantaneous or contemporaneous cancellation, there will be slow cooling over decadal timescale.
In order to achieve then this scaling, how do you foresee the deployment? Does this become a sort of part of national programs? Is this something governments have to become involved in order to deploy? Because what we've seen at the moment is this constant conversation around mitigation, around emissions reduction, which is obviously not working. How would they get involved? Has there been any early discussions with government agencies or bodies who could tackle this?
There has not been discussions yet with government agencies. I think before we're at that step, we really need to have a more precise idea of where do we get the energy from, who are the potential collaborators, and how can we deploy in such a way that contribute to solving other problems. So these are the questions that we are currently asking. So for example, we calculated like it takes about 3% of world's primary energy use right now to implement this program. So 3% it's not negligible. Right, it's actually quite gigantic, comparable to, say, the international shipping industry. But incidentally, it turns out that plastic packaging and other plastic fabrication currently is about 3 to 4%. So if we, had legislation that promoted using traditional glass containers for milk all the time and glass containers in general that you can use to buy groceries and then you return to store. If we can partner with environmental groups working on banning plastic and really think about the future sustainable state of humanity, then there's a lot of opportunities to ramp up, in a sense, the glass manufacturing industry. So these are one example of ideas we're thinking about.
So to really kind of wind up, you see this as a part of the transformation in terms of it buys us more time. It deals with the initial threat of temperature rise. But it doesn't solve the CO2 issue, but that's just something that still has to be worked on in tandem. Is this the way that you would see the problem as we are now?
Because we like to think about things holistically, we also have strategies within MEER to deal with the CO2 problem, which is less urgent than the thermal problem. So for example, MEERs are nothing but devices that's useful for handling light. So analogy is copper wires, channels for channeling electrical energy. MEERs are devices to channel solar energy. So there are many obvious ways to couple solar panels with MEERs in order to boost their per unit area electrical energy productivity, for example. So there's multiple such opportunities that remains unexploited that we think we can dramatically boost the popularity and lower the cost of solar energy at both residential and grid levels if we had to start with a large MEER manufacturing industry. So there are natural ways to help the transition to renewables if we just get jump started at first. So it's a snowball effect. The more we have of these, the faster the transition to renewable will proceed. It's very important to tackle the heat from the ground and not in the atmosphere for this exactly the long-term addressing carbon perspective. Because when you block out sunlight in the atmosphere by aerosols or sulfuric acid nanoparticles, you also cut out light for renewable energies, including solar energies. And that would slow down your transition and basically boost the persistence of fossil fuels. So any solar radiation management protocol needs to be consistent with the renewable energy transition rather than to perpetuate their use.
So that's a strong case against stratospheric particle injection or those kinds of proposals. Okay. Is there anything that you think is a major challenge going forward right now, which you're focusing on?
The major challenge are things that's beyond the point when we have stabilized Earth's climate. That is, what do we envision as the society that we want to build towards? And how do we value things? How do we place value on things and experiences and find meaning in that world? And in a sense, it's as if we almost need a model of that society in order to survive this test. So I think that's an area that we're actively thinking about, and we don't really have an answer for.
Well, that's beyond the sort of engineering challenge, I guess, because that comes down to all of our value sets, etc. But even if we try to envisage the future, and let's suppose the MEERs become something that we really do scale up and become successful, are we looking at a planet now whereby man has created a thermostat that is almost visible from high up in the sky that we can use to regulate the temperature on the Earth?
In principle, it would be consistent with such a capability, yes. But very critically, we have to recognize that while we have the capability to play God almost, it's absolute priority to use that ability to do service to ecosystems and really to step back in a way and leave space for nature to flourish. So even if we were in the short term, we're able to control this heat problem, it doesn't solve all of our problems. Our consumption would still, nobody would want to, lower their quality of living. And we are already, overstepping carrying capacity by 100%, roughly speaking. So we really need to shrink the human enterprise. And that's a conversation that needs to be had on the decadal timescale. And yes, we would be able to tune Earth's climate, but we want to reach a state where such a gigantic infrastructure will no longer be absolutely necessary.
If you've got a high concentration of greenhouse gas and you do put in a system that manages the heat, which sounds colossal and quite science fictional at this stage, it reminds me back in COP21 in Paris, I think a journalist said to Jim Hansen, "Are you telling us we've got to stop flying?" And he said, well, you're not going to get people to change by telling them to stop aspiring. And it comes back to your readdressing people's values and these ideas around aspirations. And if we pull back from nature, does this mean we're reducing our aspirations? I mean, there's a very complex sort of conversation that arises out of this world that we're trying to shape for ourselves.
Not necessarily. I don't think quality of life or enjoyment necessarily have to decrease. There are many low-hanging fruits out there for reducing our energy consumption that are rarely talked about. One example is transportation, right? That's on the order of 10% or more, much more impact than going vegan globally. And like there's such a thing called a velomobile. I don't know how many people know about. These are basically reclining bicycles with a fairing. They can be fitted with electric motors and a pretty small size electric battery. And they maintain on the order of 40 to 60 mile per hour speeds on highway very stably. And there are world records of speed in such vehicles, human powered totally, that's 120 kilometers per hour, or either kilometer or mile, at least over 100. So these vehicles would solve several problems. First of all, energy problem for a road transportation, small vehicle. The other is a congestion problem because you can fit 2 of these in each single lane highway. So if we just, were commonsensical, really ban the cars, including electric cars, and really scale down to these very much safer and much more efficient personal transportation vehicles, we solve already a huge percentage of our problems. So there are many of these simple solutions that can maybe address about a third of the current emissions. And then the remaining third can be solved by transition to renewables and also ways to make carbon cycle more closed. For example, if everybody just turned off their heat by a few degrees in the winter and a couple of degrees more in the summer, that's already on the order of, again, several percent emission, which completely outstrips what you can do by banning flying. So that's one example. Another is streaming services and all the data storage. Currently, it's about maybe 4%, and the stream less, and don't take a picture of every single meal that you have. So these are things that needs to be regulated, more tightly. Okay. So there are many such low-hanging fruits on the order of 20-30%. You can essentially address instantaneously without degrading people's life experiences. In many cases, improve health and mental health.
So it's reduce impact and expand imagination. Okay, well, look, it's been great to talk to you and get an insight into the MEER project. And it'd be great to speak to you again later in the year or at some point when it's up and running or something is developing, and see how you're getting on.
Yeah, let's talk again once we have some field experiments to showcase.
Fantastic. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks again for listening. If you are interested to help support this series and help expand the discussion around climate topics, then please do consider backing my channel via Patreon. It will help me produce more content, and you will also gain access to more expert interviews. It would be great to engage more with audiences too and understand your views on these topics.